You are listening to Sploosh, a podcast on Singapore poetry, literature, and other obsessions worth showing. Today, an interview with Theophilus Kwek, author of Giving Ground and Moving House, among others.
Mid-2000s Tumblr.
Yes.
Yeah.
I tried to keep one.
Yeah, exactly. So some things don't change, right?
Cool. Okay, so I guess we can start.
Yes.
Hi everybody, this is Sploosh. I'm Saara.
And I'm Laura Jane.
And we're here today with Theophilus Kwek.
Hello, hello. Yes, thanks for having me.
So I think we'll start by reading Theo's bio. Theophilus Kwek is a writer and editor based in Singapore. He has been shortlisted twice for the Singapore Literature Prize and won the New Poets Prize for his pamphlet, The First Five Storms. He writes widely on the issues of migration and citizenship, and his most recent poetry collection, Moving House, is published by Carcanet Press. So now that we've gotten the official bio out of the way, maybe you want to give us your own self-introduction.
Okay, yes, hello. I'm not very sure how I would describe myself actually. I think these days I tell people I write for a living, but that's not strictly true. Most of what I write at work are emails. I am just someone who enjoys writing and teaching writing, and also talking about writing. So I guess, yeah, that can be the basis of today's conversation.
Yeah.
Out of all the poems you've written, would you say you have a poem that best describes your life right now?
So I actually brought a poem that I read rather than a poem that I've written. And it's a poem called A Clock in the Square by Adrienne Rich. And I'll just read the poem first and then talk a little bit about it. A Clock in the Square. This handless clock stares blindly from its tower, refusing to acknowledge any hour. But what can one clock do to stop the game when others go on striking just the same? Whatever might of truth the gesture held, time may be silenced, but will not be stilled, nor we absolved by anyone's withdrawing from all the restless ways we must be going, and all the rings in which we have spun and swirled, whether around a clock face or a world. It's a really short poem, but I think it sort of cuts to the heart of Adrienne Rich's work. She was a very important campaigner, feminist, and social justice writer. And all of her work was premised on the idea that her writing was a way of making an intervention in the world, a world that she cared deeply about, a world that was comprised of her friends and those whose lives were vivid and rich and close to hers, but also a world that held a lot of injustice. And I think this poem for me sort of calls out the central question that I'm grappling with, which is what does it mean to have a voice in the world? What does it mean to be able to have a platform and the means and the words to intervene in conversations that are going around me? What does it mean to be able to say something to and about what I observe in the world? Whether that's something that garners grace and praise or something that does not and is deeply wrong. I think this poem also calls out the question of are we actually allowed to not say anything about the injustices in the world around us? In the poem she writes, what can one clock do to stop the game when others go on striking just the same? And the image here of a clock that refuses to chime, and yet, of course, time still goes on, is a very powerful one. And the question is, for all our railing against the world, for all the poems that we write, are we actually making any difference about the problems around us? The answer that she provides within the poem is not entirely a comforting one. The answer that she provides is that we aren't absolved by withdrawing from all the ways in which we must be going about our business, right? We aren't let off the hook if we decide to not do anything about it. It doesn't tell us that we have a positive duty to do so, but it does tell us that we have no excuse not to. And I think that's sort of what I'm just living with right now. I think for lots of us who write in Singapore, we come from positions of privilege. Certainly in the fact of writing itself, we have a voice and we have a platform, and the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we allowed to sort of sit back and not use it? Or is there some sort of a a calling or an expectation to do so. Yeah. Sorry, that was an overly long, overly serious self-introduction. But yes, that's me. Apart from that, I really enjoy my coffee. I enjoy Kaya waffles in the morning. I recently discovered a place near my work that sells them. I'm very happy about this. I, on the whole, am a dog person, but I'm not averse to cats. Yeah.
Oh, it's very comprehensive.
Yes.
So, speaking of yourself, what are you reading right now?
I am reading a book called Super Infinite, and I've posted about this several times on Instagram, so any of my trusty followers out there, all 5 of you, will probably know I'm talking about a book that's a biography of John Donne, a poet. And I first encountered Donne's work when I was studying him for A-levels. I probably understood only about 40% of it. I don't think that percentage has gone up by very much, but it's a really cool book about his life. I've also recently finished reading a book by Christian Wyman, the poet. Wyman, women. Never really knew how to pronounce that, actually. And he's also a writer whom I first encountered when I was about 18 and grappling with the questions of what does it mean to be a writer. And his earlier book of essays called My Bright Abyss spoke to a lot of those questions that I had at the time. His recent books about writing and faith, and his most recent collection, which is called Survival is a Style, have been my companions over the last few weeks.
And just sort of like jumping off of that, right? What does it mean to you to be a writer?
I think for me, the writing itself is not the point.
Okay.
Right? I think for me, being a writer is simply being in possession of a certain toolbox that you have, by no real merit of your own, had the chance to sharpen and use. And also you happen to be in the right place and time to use this set of tools. Yes. To me, that's what it means to be a writer. So finding these tools in your hands, what do you do with them? Do you use them to build a house, or do you use them to tear one down? Right? To me, honestly, it's not about writing. For all it's worth, I could have been a singer. Thank God I didn't choose that path. Yeah.
And just sort of, do you think that like intersects in like your public and private life, or like sort of in your day job versus, you know, your writing job?
Yeah, I think for me, the day job, so I'm fortunate to work in a place where I think I am able to make some change in the world. I was keen to take up a job like that. The idea of being a corporate lawyer or like someone working for a consultancy chills me to the bones. And I'm glad to work in a place where I think I do have some impact. But of course, impact takes on many different colors, shades, many different spheres. Whether I'm at my day job making that kind of change through policy work, or I'm out of my day job writing a poem, to me, it's all part of the same enterprise, the same endeavor. It's about making a change in the world, making the world a place that aligns better, that rhymes better, a place that is a little bit more just and balanced. Yeah, that happens in different ways, whether it's by writing an angry email at work or writing an angry poem at home. Yeah.
And I guess sort of like maybe appealing to like the writerly part of you, we wanted to ask you about singlit. Yeah?
So, singlet has come to be defined as a very broad sort of genre, and in fact, a lot of people can't quite define what exactly constitutes singlet. So, there can be stories set overseas but written by Singapore writers, or stories written about Singapore written by foreign writers in Singapore. So, as a poet who's written a lot about your experiences in Singapore but also overseas, I think especially from your university days, how do you think the subject matter or the voices that inhabit singlet will change in the future?
Well, so this is a age-old, complicated question. I'll try not to spend too much time on it. But really, what is Singapore? Is Singapore a place? Is Singapore an idea? Is Singapore a construct? My idea of Singapore is probably very different from your idea of Singapore. And that's the point of a nation, right? That you and this bunch of strangers sort of come together and think you're thinking about the same thing. And the whole idea of singlit as well, I think, has been debated to death. But to me, it simply means sort of any piece of writing that has been inflected by Singapore in some way. It's not really about the identity of the author, it's not really about the context of the poem. Singapore as an idea has had an impact on lots of writers who may not even be writing about Singapore per se. I think William Gibson's essay, Singapore, Disneyland with the death penalty, that is a piece of singlit because it's a piece of writing, well, creative, some say a bit too creative, non-fiction, that has been influenced by the idea of Singapore and responds to Singapore. So to me, that's sort of the broad agnostic sense in which singlit exists. And to me, it's not necessarily worthwhile, I think, thinking about what constitutes or defining this too sharply. Yeah, to me, as a writer who happens to find himself in Singapore and who happens to have communities in Singapore whom I live in, depend on, and love, I think I can't help but write singlit just as well. Yeah.
And I guess sort of like, knowing that you have like a background in history, does like inspecting this issue as a history student, how do you feel about that? Like, coming from the identity of a history student.
Yeah. So I think, the idea of Singapore history has been much contested in recent years. No thanks, of course, to the various big anniversaries that we've been having. But for me, history is the practice or the discipline of surfacing different perspectives on living and different ways of living. An old professor of mine once said that history is all about constructing an inventory of alternatives. Right? It's about understanding how people used to live, understanding how people used to dream of living, and by resurrecting those possibilities, telling us in the present day that it doesn't have to be this way. It could have been another way. There were all these other dreams, there were all these other doors closed or opened. And to me, I think that applies to Singapore as well. We live in one version of Singapore. We all live in our own version of Singapore, and that adds up to the version of Singapore we have today. But this is a Singapore that could have been in many other versions. There could have been many other product releases along the way, many product upgrades, and many ways in which this product could have succeeded or failed as well, whatever that means to you as an individual. So I think, to me, history and thinking about Singapore's many pasts are also about thinking about Singapore's many possible presents. Yeah.
And maybe perhaps, maybe we can move away from just Singapore.
Interrogating history.
Yeah, maybe something a little bit more personal, like, we've heard, or rather a little birdie told us, that you had a very disciplined writing schedule in university. Is that true? And is that why you're so prolific?
Okay, so actually, I don't think I'm moving that far away at all, because I think those things are linked. Poetry for me gives a way of exploring those possibilities that I just talked about. And for context, I went to university overseas, and I think, for lots of Singaporean writers who spend time abroad, it's a cliche by now to say that, the distance has given me a new perspective on Singapore. And indeed, I think the distance does force you to think about those possibilities, right? Because it takes you away from the current version 1.0 of Singapore that you're most used to. So with that distance, you're like, hang on, is this really what I remember about Singapore? Is this really the way Singapore is right now? Or could it have shifted in my absence, So yes, during the time I was away, I wrote quite compulsively. It helped that the fees that were, the university fees where I studied seemed mostly to go to my library subscription. And most of the rest of the time, I found myself in attending lectures that weren't really related to my subjects, hanging out in pubs and cafes, writing or finding ways to write. And I did have a fairly disciplined schedule of sitting down every other Thursday morning in the same seats in the same cafe and not letting myself get up until I'd finished the draft of a poem. And what this sort of forced me to do was to look for fresh material, because I would sit down and face a blank page, and the £2 cup of coffee that I bought would already be steadily diminishing. And you just have to write something before you reach the bottom of the glass. And that sort of forced me to look at what had happened during the week, claw through the pages of my history syllabus, scroll Facebook, yes, I still use Facebook, till I reach a headline that jumps out at me, or simply sort of think about stories from childhood that might provide some fodder. And that sort of allowed me to exit the comfort zone of what I would normally write about and find, as some may say, new inspiration. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, you can't just be waiting for inspiration to strike. You have to sort of force yourself to get something out. But do you still have like a similarly disciplined, rigorous writing schedule now?
Alas, to my shame, no. I am now very much a public holiday writer. And we had a few near the beginning of the year, and those were fantastic, but I don't think we'll have another one for a while. I'm a bit sad about that. It really takes quite a lot more discipline these days to sort of clear the schedule and put aside other things. But this is also the reason why I'm not a novelist, because it would simply be impossible, I think, with the current work schedule, to write anything that's not a poem or an essay. Prose actually lends itself better, I find, to the writing life, because it's much easier to add or subtract a few sentences on the bus home or in between emails than it is to sort of take a poem from draft to completion. I think that requires a lot more dedicated hours in a block and in sort of the right kind of context that it's hard to achieve at work. That said, well, I do, I'm also, because I'm quite a solitary writer, so it does mean that I have to find sort of time alone and away from everything else, and a solid chunk of those few hours to be able to produce something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just sort of like very selfishly asking for myself, like how do you actually like carve out the time? Because I mean, before you arrived, we were just talking about like how you just seem to like be able to squeeze out time from your like super packed schedule. So
Just
how
do
do
everything.
how do you like carve out the time to actually sit down and write? Because as a student, I
Doesn't
find
everyone
it so hard.
else have 72 hours
It's
as well?
so hard. Like, do you just like like turn off your devices? Do you like, how do you do it?
Okay, so my phone, and I think my fiance will probably recognize this, but my phone is usually on flight mode.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's not normal.
And I try to pack replying to messages into half-hour pockets. Or say 15-minute pockets. So if I know the bus is arriving in 15 minutes, then I will turn off the flight mode. The messages will pour in. I'll spend 15 minutes replying to all of them, and then it goes back on flight mode. So I don't constantly get notifications.
Not chronically online.
Not chronically online. I think it also involves scheduling ahead. So I will sort of put blocks in my calendar, in my schedule, where nothing else is allowed to intrude. Sometimes, of course, I mean, I don't really have control over anything else in the world. So sometimes life happens, and then that block of time disappears, and you might not get another one for 6-7 weeks. And that's just too bad. Just means that you weren't meant to write that poem.
It's true.
Yeah. True. And that's fine. I think at this, I don't want to sound very old, but at this point in my writing life, I don't really think that I have to write that poem anymore. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen lah. The world's not a better or worse place without it. Someone else will write it, whatever. And even if they don't, it's fine. I believe very much that at the point that you're writing, if you have something to say, it matters because you wrote it at that point in time. And after that happens and the poem goes out into the world, it takes on a life of its own. It's no longer yours. It doesn't matter if you wrote it or someone else did. So to me, really, there's not much loss of sort of missing the moment. And I don't go like, I had such a good idea 3 weeks ago and I never got to write it down, because, if you didn't, I guess it wasn't that good an idea after all. Yeah. and that's fine. Yeah.
So with that sort of mindset, do you think the subject matter of your poetry has also changed?
Maybe actually that's a really good question. Maybe it links, because I've been writing a lot about loss and impermanence.
Whoa.
Yeah. I think subject matter comes and goes. It's quite seasonal as well. And I've said this to lots of people now that I think the current project that I'm in, or the bigger project I'm in, involves the changing of the Singapore landscape. This is suddenly very like throwback to the 90s, because I know Alvin Pang and everyone else has done that already. But I think we are sort of in a new wave of relocations and dislocations in the Singapore landscape with very different drivers, right? So beyond the passing of an older generation and also the passing of an older generation of infrastructure, think about Golden Mile, think about the Sentosa Merlion, think about estates like Dawson and Tanglin Halt, which have been searched. It's also about individual landscapes that are lost. Think about workplace accidents among migrant workers. Think about dormitories that became overcrowded, taken down, repurposed. Think about landscapes that were grown over and then mown down again during COVID. A very different set of drivers to the changing Singapore landscape. It's not so much about the loss of tradition, the loss of shop houses that so many people are writing about in the 90s and late 80s. I think it's much more today about a younger generation that grew up in the post-developmental sort of stage of Singapore, being confronted with the fact that Singapore is still being pulled from under their feet, and the many harms and losses that are occasioned by this. So that's the current project. It actually involves me going to sit in kopitiams in Tanglin Halt quite a lot, and in other places that have been lost or lost to time. And I finish a tasty a lot faster than a cup of coffee, so it just forces me to write quicker. Yeah.
And is this like the same process that you use for all your past collections, or tying it to like a physical locale, or?
Okay, so for the first book, which I was of course still in school at the time, and I had a notebook, but since then I've not had a notebook. So very different sort of process. I think at least when I was in secondary school or JC, this notebook really allowed me to be like a magpie, to sort of like collect different things that people say during the day, or like, things that I remember. And I've just been reading that in John Donne's time, in the 16th century, they would call these books commonplace books. And a commonplace book was, a folio or a folder of just all these little scraps that you collect. It's quite mid-2000s Tumblr.
Yes.
Yeah.
I tried to keep one.
Yeah, exactly. So some things don't change, right? So as a teenager, I had a notebook and I put lots of stuff in there. I also had a blog spot with very embarrassing music that came on when you arrived on the page. But since then, the notebook hasn't been such an integral part of the process. I think today I'm a lot better at just letting things go and then finding new stuff, or trusting that new stuff will turn up. Yeah, something new must come up.
And sort of like looking back to maybe like your past collections, right? Which of your collections is your favorite, and which is your least favorite?
Well, this is actually quite an easy question to answer, because my favorite collection will always be the most recent one, and my least favorite one will always be the oldest one, the very first one. Yes, and that's just because you become a different person after the book is published, and thankfully so. If you're still the same person that you were at 18, something will be very wrong. So it's good. It's good that I've changed, that the poems have changed, that the books have changed. I still quite like the most recent collection. I don't have that many gripes about it, apart from the fact that, fun story, I forgot to put in a contents page. So Moving House does not have a contents page. And everybody, the publisher, editor, and I only noticed this after it was printed. So we were like, oh well, that's fine. People will just have to flip the pages. Yeah.
Yeah, it adds to the
Oh,
experience.
Yeah, and I still quite like the themes and ideas that are explored in Moving House. Yeah, well, soon I guess I'll have to like the next one.
Yeah, and well, Moving House was published overseas, right? So, maybe jumping off of that, like having published both in Singapore and overseas, how do you feel like the industry and the market is different, maybe?
Well, both the Singaporean poetry scene and that of the UK has been swamped, maybe that's too harsh a word, has been infiltrated, also quite a harsh word, but certainly by a process of slow and gentle osmosis at the very least, has become much more taken with contemporary American poetry and poetics, right? And this is not to ignite a culture war debate. That's not where this is going. It's more that I think there are today a lot more similarities between these poetry markets simply by the fact of circulation, right? Everybody has the same sort of foundational Ocean Vuong experience. Actually, and this wasn't too different because, when I started writing, it was the foundational Richard Syken experience. And today it's sort of the same set of starter texts that everybody reads, whether you're starting to write in the UK or in Singapore or in the US, at least as far as Anglophone writing goes. And the fact that it is Ocean Vuong, the child of a refugee who is yet very much a representative of contemporary American poetics in terms of his style and his concerns, and the sort of foregrounding of his voice, I think that says something to our moment, and that's something to celebrate. And yet, I think what's different is that lots of the writing in Singapore, while very heavily influenced by contemporary trends, does not have so much of an awareness of tradition. And this is both a good and bad thing, right? You don't get people writing clunky, well, apart from me, you don't get people sort of writing clunky, like John Donne inflected poems, and that's great. At the same time, for the worse, I think lots of new writing that's coming out of Singapore doesn't have so much of a sense of what it's responding to in terms of historical work. At best, I think lots of new Singapore writers are responding to Singapore writers of the 80s and 90s, or early 2000s, early Alfian, early Yisheng, early Cyril. And that's great. But those voices that they're responding to were themselves responding to older traditions. And I don't see so much of a consciousness of that lineage in new Singapore writing. Whereas I think in the UK, or at least new writers in the UK are still sort of, or have a deeper and longer understanding of what they're responding to. And that's also a market that I suppose the most recent book tried to speak to. In any case, lots of the poems in the most recent book were written while I was in the UK and responding to the voices of those around me who were in turn responding to the tradition that they saw. So yes, different sense of tradition, different sense of where we're from and where we're going. And that's not a good or bad thing. In a sense, it's quite refreshing to have this sort of much shorter time scale in Singapore. But sometimes that also leads to a kind of more homogeneous, younger voice in Singapore, because the frame of reference is so short and so similar.
So speaking of who we are and are not responding to, do you think there are any voices in local poetry who are under or overrepresented?
Well, I under overrepresented. Okay, not to. So I think local poetry, insofar as published poetry goes, in the last 10 years has diversified by far, right? And this is owing to the presence of independent publishers, independent bookstores, independent groups of readerships, the resurgence that we have seen in speculative writing, the foregrounding of migrants' voices, of other sort of narratives that would not have found as comfortable a place in Singapore writing 15, 20 years ago. That's all to be celebrated. So what else? Where else are the gaps? I think we still have quite a high proportion of Bukit Timah writing. And Laura-Jane will have heard me use this phrase before. And by that, I mean a writing that sort of comes out of the lyric potential of privilege. And I should start off by also saying that I myself have been guilty of this. And I think particularly in my third book, Giving Ground, although I not ventured near Bukit Timah in a while. But Giving Ground, I think, came out of my idea at the time where I was heading off to university overseas of writing about the world as sort of this traveller figure that was passing through different contexts and sort of through them seeing some reflection of Singapore. It was all very Italo Calvino, all very see the world through a grain of sand-ish thinking, and without really questioning or thinking more deeply about the privilege of being able to move easily across borders, the privilege also to be able to navigate all these different, I should also say European contexts, thanks to language and tradition and cultural familiarity and all of that. So I think Moving House tries to interrogate all of that a lot more, so I like Moving House a bit more. But I think that the type of writing that Giving Ground, in a sense, fell into, I think that's still quite overrepresented in Singapore writing. And I think that's a problem. I also think that there's another set of writing that's overrepresented. You have started me off on an unstoppable spiel now. Is confessional writing. Confessional writing has a very important place in the development of Singapore poetry, right? Because you have a whole generation in the sort of 80s and mid-90s who were responding to the landscape and the changes in the landscape as they saw it, and we spoke a bit about this earlier. And then you have a wave of confessional poets in the early 2000s who are like, hang on, there's no space for us in this landscape that you're writing about, right? In this landscape that all you sort of Chinese male poets are writing about, Chinese male heterosexual poets are writing about, there's no space for my voice. And confessional poetry in the early 2000s, was a very important vehicle for those voices to take their rightful place, which is in the center of the narrative, along with everybody else's. Today, however, I think there is a preponderance of confessional writing. And what do I mean by that? I think there are a lot of poets who are writing in a confessional mode of expression that foregrounds their own thoughts, feelings, and expressions about the world, but without really a sense of how their own thoughts, feelings, and expressions fit in the wider landscape or fit in the wider sort of societal picture. There isn't so much of a sense of speaking into the world or speaking into a world or responding to what's out there in the world, and it's more so about me and what I'm feeling at this point in time and what I'm going through. And while all that is, of course, important, it tends to then become decontextualized. So I think there's a lot of young confessional writing that's coming out that's quite, in a sense, self-concerned. And once again, I should say that this is not a bad thing, but I think there's a lot of it, and I think it could be balanced out with a greater awareness about the world that these voices are speaking into. So yes, I've just given you two very dangerous answers to that question, but there you go.
And sort of like with, the current state of affairs with, Anglophone poetry publishing in Singapore, do you see that changing the landscape? Do you see that changing, the type of writing that's being produced? Well,
I think Anglophone poetry publishing in Singapore has ebbed and waned, right? I wrote a book chapter about this some time ago for the Singapore Book Publishing Association's sort of anniversary anthology. And since then, since I wrote that book chapter, so much more has happened. I think I have to do a rewrite now. But I think with those ebbs and wanes, sort of different kinds of concerns and voices get to take center stage, and I think that's healthy. Some may be familiar with the Red Wheelbarrow Press, which for a while in the first decade of the 2000s was bringing out the voices of really good spoken word poets. And this was a time where spoken word was making a comeback in Singapore, a time where it was easier to find performance venues, where open mics and poetry slams were being organized, and these became a channel to surface new voices, some of whom are very established voices today, right? So a press emerged, was able to serve as a platform for these voices, and had a tangible impact on the kind of poetry landscape that we have today. Today, publishers, once again, will come and go. Even the publishers that have stayed the course will transform over time. Ethos Books is a prime example of this. I speak of Ethos with a lot of love. And from first gen Ethos to the current Ethos mandate and sort of path that they've carved out for themselves, that's gone through a lot of change, and that's a healthy thing, right? The company has responded to its readership, it's responded to the market, but also responded to their own artistic vision of what they want a good small press in Singapore to deliver. And I think that's great. I think new presses will come along to fill the void where underrepresented voices become urgent enough. I should also say on that note that self-publishing has become a lot more viable today, right? A couple of migrant poets have self-published, and their self-published work has been well reviewed, and indeed reviewers have praised the potential of self-publishing to bring an unvarnished, unedited, ungate-kept different voice into the world. Because of course when you go through conventional publishing routes, right, there is some of that uniqueness that gets watered down. So self-publishing, huge potential. Thank you, Internet. And it's great that we're seeing more of that as well.
And so as a reader of poetry and also an editor, most recently in your anthology collection, Some Dreams From Now, you can plugging it on this podcast as well. What are some of your pet peeves or red flags when it comes to poetry?
Well, thanks for the plug. Some Dreams From Now is a new anthology of old writing. It is an anthology that plumbs the depths of one particular school's archives, the Raffles Institution archives. And it is a set of archives that has a particularly long history in Anglophone writing in and from Singapore, simply because the school has been around for a while and, for better or for worse, has that sort of institutional resources to keep these archives intact. And the stories that we see from this archive are the perspectives of a very small subset of students, but on a very dynamically changing city around them that has gone from being part of the British Empire to under Japanese occupation to part of Malaysia, and of course where we are today. So those perspectives, I think, are quite unique to have this sort of unbroken archival record, and I'm very proud to be able to present it with the help of a team of very dedicated and capable students. So it's available in all good bookstores, by which I mean Kinokuniya, and please go pick up your copy. But, well, coming back to your question about pet peeves as an editor, I think I've already mentioned one of my pet peeves, which is self-indulgence. I think the other pet peeve that I would have is when writers perhaps hold too tightly to this idea that they are the sole creator of their work. What do I not mean by that? I do not mean that copyright is unimportant. So, perish the thought. But what do I mean by that? I do mean that more writers should take a view of their work as something that is collaboratively created, whether that's with other writers and artists, or with an editor, or with the aesthetics of the publication, the journal, the website, whatever, that they eventually find themselves in the company of. Too many writers hold to this notion of presenting their work in a vacuum, right? Of them sitting at their tables and coming out with something entirely untouched by the world, and then for this to be presented on an presumably empty website devoid of context. That's simply not the way publishing works, right? Publishing at its heart is the act of presenting a voice in a world. And the process of publishing thus has to be conscious of that world, conscious of the community into which it is speaking, the community it is joining, the conversation it's responding to, and the many others who work behind the scenes or in front of the scenes, as the case may be, to make that presentation of your voice possible. And you can either work with them or against them, and it's very annoying when poets choose to work against them. Yeah, so that's my other pet peeve. Yeah.
Conversely, what about green flags?
Green flags. Oh, that's a great question. Okay, please cut out this part where I'm thinking.
One eternity later.
All right, so green flags as an editor, I think it's always really refreshing to read first a set of submissions that sticks within the submission rules. So basics, yeah. If I say 3 to 5 pages, I'm not going to read the 17th page. Too bad. And what this shows is a writer who is willing to think about and prioritize their best work, and or to try out something new that they've written in a different landscape, and to sort of take the feedback and the verdict of a set of editors or a certain readership and learn from it. I think that's great, and I think that speaks to a deeper willingness as a writer to recognize that the writing is only 5% of the work, right? The next 80% of the work is the editing, and the editing takes place in response to feedback, in response to readers, in response to sort of the wider conversation that you're speaking into. But the editing also requires you to put yourself in a position of your audience. It requires a lot of empathy. It requires you to realize that someone listening and hearing your voice for the first time will approach it very differently from the voice that's in your head, and that's entirely fine. And that's what it takes to put a voice in the world. It requires you to first empathize with those whom you're about to inflict your voice on. So I've covered 5% and 80%, there's a remaining 50%, that's the readership, right? And including your first readers, that's your workshop group, your editor, etc. I've said a bit about that. But also the wider readership, right? And the wider readership is essential to shaping the development of any writing career. Because, look, Shakespeare would have written very differently if he was alive today, thankfully. And we would have written differently if we lived in the time of Shakespeare. And that's fine. Your voice doesn't exist in a vacuum. It should respond to the people whom you want to write for. And they are just as important or more important than you are.
Great. Thanks so much for that.
Self-awareness.
Yes.
It's important.
Yay!
So maybe we put out an open call for questions for you.
Oh dear.
From our followers.
Should I be worried?
Ask me anything.
Big fans of you, I suppose. So I guess we'll ask a couple of questions from there.
Yeah, I think we could ask like a fun one. There's this one that asks.
Are there unfun ones?
I mean, yeah,
There are more serious
yeah,
ones.
there are more serious ones.
Okay,
but
let's do a fun one.
Jolt
Yeah.
things up a
Yeah.
bit. What is your desert island poetry playlist?
Ooh, okay, Desert Island Poetry Playlist. Well, if you're starting from a point of farce and desperation, then what you really want in your life is a bit of Kim Adonizio. Someone who is willing to take wisecracks at death, someone whose writing is as mordant and trenchant as the best of them, and who can sort of write to you as if you're in a bar and having an argument with an old friend. that's the sort of refreshing, cold water in the face writing that I would want on a desert island. And then maybe I go for some sort of comfort, because I think I need that as well. And for me, the comfort reading is always Seamus Heaney.
Wow, Kim Adenizio and Seamus.
And Seamus Heaney. Yeah.
Great.
Combination.
Neither without the other.
Wow.
Great. Well, considering Sploosh is, a very youth-oriented organization, how does it feel having been published so young at, I think, 18? I think that's not something that a lot of people can claim to have done.
Saara, if I might add.
I think that I would probably have done things very differently, but I think that at the time I could not have done things any differently. I think that that first book was the product of very much kindness. I have written elsewhere before about the many chance encounters, most importantly with Fong Ho Fang, who was the founder and publisher of Ethos Books, that led directly to the conversations that seeded that collection. Looking back, I think what I would probably have done, and what I do tell my students today to do, is to send their writing out to more places first, journals, magazines, etc. The practical reason, of course, is that after it appears in a book, no journal will take it. But the less practical reason is also that at that age and at that stage, what you really need is readership. You need an editor to tell you this isn't working. You need readers to tell you what hit them in the gut or didn't. And you're not going to find that in your Sec 4 class, right? Or you might, if you have an unusually perceptive Sec 4 class. Sorry, everyone from 4P who is listening to this. But you simply need that wider set of reactions, and you're not going to get that on your own. So I would probably have done a bit more of that. But what I lacked in that, I made up with by having a very supportive editorial team at Ethos, who was willing to very patiently work with me and tell me what was or wasn't working. Many of them are now no longer at Ethos. I think Adelina, who is working on my book then, is now at the Projector. Mr. Fong, of course, has gone on to many other adventures. But I think that sort of supportive editorial culture made up for a lot of my inexperience.
And on top of maybe like the editorial culture, we also have a question that asks, who are your greatest inspirations and influences?
Speaking of responding to people and being aware of.
Well, I was very fortunate to have some very important mentors quite early on in my writing life. And Alvin Pang, Aaron Maniam, Cyril Wong, Darren Xiao, Aaron Lee. I sort of learned different things from them at different points. And they, of course, also were speaking from a certain generation and set of experiences. And many of them, in fact, were published around the same time, between 1995 and the early 2000s. And apart from sort of this group of mentors, I think who I've also been really fortunate to meet, I think particularly in my time overseas, was lots of friends from the British writing scene who are today carving out their own careers as writers. Folks like Mary Jean Chan, Phoebe Stoops, Imogen Castles, and Alan Buckley, and many, many others who were very important parts of my time in the UK. I owe a lot to them as well because they sort of showed me different ways of being a writer. I think having met the first set of names, I was very acquainted with one way of being a writer. And the second set of names gave me many more pathways to that. What's most important, I think, for a young poet, there are two realizations. The first is to see first a writer who looks and sounds like you. I think there's nothing more powerful than that. It tells you that, oh, I also can, right? But then after that, it's equally important to meet lots of other writers who don't look and sound like you and who show you other ways of being yourself. And they are the ones who will then prompt you to keep looking and keep experimenting and keep trying out new things.
That's so true.
I guess eventually the student becomes the teacher as well, right?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy today to do a lot of teaching. It takes me away from the office, which is amazing. I love being in the classroom. I really respect teachers who can do it full-time because it's very emotionally draining. But I do enjoy being in the classroom and working with students and finding new ways and new kinds of content to bring to my students. I'm very happy that Ben King and Annette Lee have made lots of fantastic videos that I can use as writing prompts. But I'm also very grateful to all the Singaporean writers out there who have recorded yourselves reading out your poems and put it on YouTube. Alvin Pang's video of himself reading the poem Candles I have used in so many workshops. And these are all fantastic resources. But for me, being in the classroom or working with 2 or 3 much smaller group of students in a mentorship setting, that's very important to me because, well, sometimes I bring my own work to share and the students become my workshop group, and that's great. But sometimes also in working with writers who are sort of at the start of their writing journeys and careers, forces me to think again and again about actually what got me started and why I'm still here. And that's very important for me. Yeah.
Best piece of advice you can give as a friend?
As a friend, be ready to tell your friend when they've written a bad poem.
Yes, oh, that's so hard.
Yeah,
That is
it's so hard, but it's so important because they're not going to hear it from their adoring fans or their distant acquaintances. It takes a great deal of honesty. And I mean a bad poem in every sense. I mean in an aesthetic sense, but I also mean in an ethical sense. And I think friends need to call each other out on our ethical failings, of which we all have many. And it's important because if we see ourselves, writers, as people who speak into the world, and people who have a privileged platform to do so, then you always need to be questioning the way that you use that platform, and you always need to have an awareness of whether, of your own blind spots in doing so. Yeah, and so if any of my friends are listening to this, yeah, please hit me around the head if I've said something bad.
And maybe sort of to wrap it up with a spicy question, what is one thing you can't stand about writers and writing? In their writing, yeah, writers in their writing.
I cannot stand, well, this comes first to mind because I was just talking to another writer about this yesterday. I cannot stand the idea of the inspired writer. Well, there's so many talks and workshops that you go to or you do, and then someone in the audience sort of stands up and asks the stock question at the end to fill the silence, which is, where do you get your inspiration?
Yes, oh my gosh.
And I think the idea of inspiration is a misplaced one, right? Because it sort of assumes that there are writers who are blessed by the angels, for whom writing comes from an external source, a muse, a god, a sort of external, sort of almost divine source, and that this writer has to write by privilege of being the chosen one. I think this sort of plays into the image of the writer as someone who is who is different from everyone else, who is on a pedestal, who is anointed to speak on behalf of others. And I, at the bottom of my heart, reject that idea of the writer. To me, as I said earlier in this conversation, the writer is someone who simply, by good fortune or else, or by practice, comes into possession of a set of skills, a set of tools. Anyone can come into possession of this set of tools, given sort of the right redistribution of resources, including cultural capital, the right kinds of environments for people to learn and grow in. Anyone should be able to use language to make change in the world. You do not have to be inspired. You certainly do not have to live in Bukit Timah. And I think at heart, the idea of writing as something that is open to anyone and that can make any kind of change happen, that possibility is preserved if we discard the idea of the inspired writer. Yeah.
It's great. Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming here today and speaking with us.
Yeah, and
We really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Getting to hear what you have to say.
yeah.
Yeah, for all those who are just listening to this in a car or something, we are actually in a very cozy confines of Singlit Station. I urge you to pay a visit, especially to come here for a sploocious event in 2 or 3 weekends' time.
On the 25th of March.
Yes, thanks very much for filling in the date. And we have some fantastic people who are coming to read to us, including a poet whom I'm very much a fan of, Nathaniel Chu, whose writing has also appeared in the recent New Singapore Poetry Anthology, which you can also find at all good bookstores where you can find Some Dreams From Now.
We'll probably be selling it there as well.
Yes,
like last time.
will be available at the
Sploosh
event.
session number 2.
Yes.
Amazing.
All right.
See you all there.
Bye-bye.
Bye.